of February 2021. I want to talk to you about something that's really important that we need to keep in the forefront of our thinking as African Americans, and that is the issue of voting rights. Voting rights. Voting rights are so critical because they enable us to have a voice in the people who represent us, not only in DC, in the United States government, but also locally and statewide. And, with respect to who's district attorney, who is mayor of our cities, who's on the school board. I mean, so many things that impact our lives on a daily basis. And our voting rights, we had to fight for them with our blood, sweat, and tears. Many people lost their lives fighting for our right to vote. And we just cannot give away those rights. We cannot allow people to chip away at those rights. And that's exactly what they're trying to do. We were able to vote in the first African-American president in 2008. And here recently, we were able to vote in the first African-American woman as vice president. There are powerful forces who hate that and who are going to and are busy currently doing everything they can to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future, okay? So, what do we need to do about this? What should be our response? We got the Congressional Black Caucus, who is working hard to prevent this. We have the NAACP, we have the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, we have the Legal Defense, Education and Defense Fund that's associated with the NAACP. We got Al Sharpton's organization, National Action Network. We have Rainbow Push Coalition, Jesse Jackson's organization, and we have scores of other organizations around the country. But what is it that we can do? We, you and me, as citizens of the United States, African American citizens, what do we need to be doing to protect our right to vote? We cannot stand by and let our enemies disenfranchise us. And that is what they're doing as we speak. They're in state legislatures doing everything they can, thinking of all kinds of reasons as to why we should not be able to vote. And we got to fight that. We got to resist that. We can't let that happen. And so one of the things that I want to remind you of, one of the things that I want to keep, again, and keep reminding you of, is what I intend to do, is about the work of this great man here and a piece of legislation that is named in his honor. And this is, as we know, the late, great Representative John Lewis. Representative Lewis gave his life, he spent his life fighting for our right to vote. It wasn't just him, there were many others, but he recently has become the face of voting rights for African Americans. What can we do to see to it that Mr. Lewis's, the legislation that's named in his honor, what can we do to see to it that that legislation is passed? And I'm talking fast, all right? We helped Joe Biden and Kamala Harris get elected. Again, Kamala Harris is vice president, Joe Biden as president. And it was really largely our votes, okay? That is the reason why this man is president. Donald Trump, the GOP, and MAGA, however you want to say it. I think it's MAGA, Make America Great Again is their slogan. They're doing everything they can to see to it that our right to vote is chipped away. Trump came for our votes when he told this big lie about the fact that the election had been stolen from him. He came for our votes, and we see that the overwhelming majority of the GOP Congresspeople stood with him in trying to disenfranchise our votes. And they're still doing it. They're working harder. They recently acquitted him for inciting a riot to disenfranchise. That's what that was about. He sent those people to Congress and to disenfranchise our millions and millions of votes that put Joe Biden in the presidency and Kamala Harris in the vice presidency. All right? So they haven't gone anywhere. They're still out there. They're working hard. What can we do? Let me talk to you a little bit about a piece of legislation that's named again in John Lewis's name. I'm going to bring it up on the screen. Again, let me show you a picture of this great man, the late, great Representative John Lewis. Now you see on the screen with me is a document, and this is the legislation that I am currently talking about. And let me slide over just a little bit so you can see it really well. And I want to talk about this legislation. Before I talk about this legislation, let me tell you why it is so important. This legislation is called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Well, let me tell you why this piece of legislation is critical. It's critical. Let me tell you why. So as I just said, we have had to fight with our blood, sweat, and tears to get the right to vote. The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment are amendments that affect our lives as African Americans. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment made us citizens and gave us equal rights under the law, equal protection rights under the law, and due process rights under our Constitution. And then the 15th Amendment gave us the right to vote. But in order to give the 15th Amendment power, Congress had to enact the Voting Rights Act. Okay? That was done in the mid-60s. The Voting Rights Act. If memory serves me correctly, I think it was done shortly after Dr. King was assassinated. Could be wrong about that, but I believe that's right. And the reason the Voting Rights Act was enacted, the reason Congress enacted it was because although the 15th Amendment gave us the right to vote, Southerners, whites, white supremacists were doing everything they can to interfere with our right to vote. We couldn't just walk up and vote like everybody else. We had either poll taxes, we had grandfather clauses, we had to answer silly questions like how many jelly beans are in a jar, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, crazy stuff like that before we could cast our votes. And all of that was done to disenfranchise us. And it was done largely in southern states. And so Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act to prevent those types to prevent people from implementing those types of actions to interfere with our right to vote. And essentially the Voting Rights Act targeted a few states, largely in the South, who had all these disenfranchising laws in place and customs and so forth. And the Voting Rights Act required that they submit whatever changes they wanted to make to their state's voting laws. They had to submit that to the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, and the Department of Justice had to approve it before they were to go into place. Well, there is a case, a U.S. Supreme Court case that came down during the Obama administration that basically gutted the Voting Rights Act. Let me tell you about it. Let me get a drink of water. The name of that U.S. Supreme Court case is Shelby County versus Holder. A county in the state of Alabama sued then Attorney General Eric Holder and asked the U.S. Supreme Court to set aside certain provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And the U.S. Supreme Court did so on the notion that there was no longer a need to protect the voting rights of African Americans because we had just voted in a black president. Okay? That was silly, but the court agreed. Now, immediately upon the passing that court ruling, Shelby County versus Holder, immediately afterwards, states began to implement all sorts of changes to their voting laws to prevent us from voting. They started implementing voting ID laws that targeted African Americans. They closed down a number of poll stations. They cut back early voting. They're in their state legislatures as we speak right now attacking early voting and mail-in voting, because that was one of the big ways that Joe Biden became president. A lot of blacks this past election, voted, early voting, mail-in voting, etc. So the Voting Rights Act was gutted by this Shelby County versus Holder case, and states began to start implementing those same old disenfranchising laws that were on the books in the 50s and 60s and 40s that kept us from voting. They're trying to do that again. If you believe your right to vote is precious, you must take this seriously. You must take this seriously if you believe your voting rights are important, are critical, I would say. You can't look back, you can't look to other people, the people you see on TV, the people in Congress, the folks who are, the celebrities, and we can't just depend on those people. You and I must involve ourselves in this fight, okay, to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed. We got Joe Biden elected. He owes us. It's just that simple. He owes us. And we want him to pay up, and we want him to pay up now. Now. Within the first 100 days of his administration, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act should be enacted by Congress. It's passed the House already. Mitch McConnell, when he was the Senate Majority Leader, would not allow it to come up for a vote. Well, things have changed. Okay? There are two recently Democratic senators who were elected. Now the Senate is 50-50, and Kamala Harris as vice president can go in and break ties. There is nothing preventing nothing preventing Joe Biden from signing into law the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Okay? Now, here's what the GOP will do, those that are in the Senate. Okay? I say there's nothing that will stop it. Well, here's what they can try to do. They can try to filibuster. Okay? They can try to filibuster, and they probably will try to filibuster. But I still think that we can get this passed if Joe Biden gets behind it, and we get behind it, and we push those senators to get behind this. All right? This is critical. Now, what does it do? What does the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act do? All right, I have it there in front of my screen, on my screen there. I don't know if you can read it. If you can't read it, just Google it, and you can find it. It's very easy to find. All right? So, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act responds to current conditions in voting today by restoring the full protection of the original Bipartisan Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was last reauthorized by Congress in 2006, but gutted by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013, just like I said, because of that Shelby County decision. And again, many southern states have been attacking our voting rights ever since. Well, in order to stop in their tracks those states, we got to get this piece of legislation passed. All right? Now, the second thing that this says is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act creates a new coverage formula that applies to all states and hinges on a finding of repeated voting rights violations in the preceding 25 years. All this means is, and this is a little different and even better than the original Voting Rights Act, because this would apply to all states, not just the states that were targeted under the old Voting Rights Act. This would allow the Department of Justice to stop any state, Southern, Northern, Midwestern, Southwestern, Eastern, whatever, from implementing laws that will interfere with our right to vote as African Americans. That is wonderful. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act establishes a targeted process for reviewing voting changes in jurisdictions nationwide, focused on measures that have historically been used to discriminate against voters. So whatever discriminatory measures states have implemented, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, again named in John Lewis's honor, would enable the Department of Justice to go at those states and to stop them from interfering with our right to vote. Listen, it is very, very simple. The Republican Party knows that it will lose elections, national elections, statewide elections, etc., if more people voted, especially if more black people voted. So their only way of winning is doing everything possible to stop black people from voting. We cannot let them do that, because if we don't vote in record numbers, both nationwide elections and local elections, more Donald Trumps will be in positions of power, spewing and implementing their white supremacist policies, all because we don't go vote. We turned out this time, this past election, in record numbers, and you see what happened. We got rid of Trump. We got Biden in office. We got the first black vice president elected. We turned a red state purple, at least, the state of Georgia, okay? All because of our ability to vote and our commitment to vote. So it's critical, though, that we get this piece of legislation passed, because our enemies also noticed our voting power. They noticed that we were able to, despite their best efforts, we were able to get Biden elected and Kamala Harris elected. They noticed that too. And I promise you, they're in state legislatures, sitting around tables, doing everything they can to come up with strategies to stop us from voting going forward. We can't let that happen. And one of the biggest things that we can do is to help get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed. What can you do? Talk about it. Talk about it with your friends, with your family, your coworkers. Tell them about it. Tell them why it's so important. Educate yourself about it. Read up on it. Call your senator. Whatever state you're in, there are 2 senators that represent you. Call their offices. Put the pressure on them. Let them know that we're watching. Some of them are coming up for re-election. Let them know that we're watching, that we will go out and do everything we can to see to it that they don't get re-elected if they do not support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We have power. This is a democracy. Our voices are powerful if we make them heard. I am challenging you to get involved in this fight, and let's get this piece of legislation on Joe Biden's desk so he can sign it into law within the first 100 days of his administration. And he's been in office now about a month or so. So let's get busy. Let's get busy. Thank you for watching. God bless you.